Yeah, briefly, I guess. The book was the fruit of a project that I started back in the mid-90s working on ancient associations of, and we can talk more about what kinds of associations there are. But what I realized pretty quickly is that we know a lot more about what happened in those groups than we know about what happened in Christ groups. There's some basic questions. How big was a Christ group? We don't know. How did they finance themselves? We don't know. Was it typical to be gender inclusive or gender exclusive? You can't know that until you look at other groups to see whether that's a unusual practice or a common one. So there's a whole host of questions that we don't have any data on Christ groups. And so the point of the book is to mobilize the rich evidence that we've got from other associations and use that to at least set some parameters to our imagination. It doesn't manufacture data. That is, by looking at associations, it doesn't tell us anything more about Christ groups. But what it does is it sets a kind of range of possibilities of things that they might have done. It sets a range of possibilities for how big they were, how small they were, how they financed themselves, what they did with their dead, and a whole lot of other questions like that. So, and that's what you use the term heuristic in the introduction. That's a heuristic approach to Christ associations. That is to use another data set to help us ask questions and at least to hypothesize some possibilities for Christ groups.
I can't wait to dive into this with you, because if we can understand, it's like saying, can we get the zeitgeist? Can we get the contemporaneous movements that were surrounding this? What did they do? How did they do it? Well, that should reflect if everyone who's in the world is living in the same world. You know, you got to eat from the same places. You kind of do things similarly. We can probably glean something that would give us a reflection of early Christianity and what they would have done, their practices and such. And maybe from the literature we do have that's early, like Paul and other things. So maybe we can have some fun today. Get the book. If you want true salvation, I say it every time. You want a mansion in heaven, buy the book. Hallelujah. Your previous interview that you did, you did with Neil, Christ Assemblies. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. Neil's my buddy, Gnostic Informant. Go subscribe to my buddy Neil. He's doing all sorts of work, and show the community some love. Join the Patreon. I did send out this email this morning letting everybody know we will be interviewing Dr. Kloppenborg. And also I have many other interviews that I have never released. And I mean many, 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 many. You help the community grow. We're going to keep doing this. Let's go ahead and dive in and get wet, because he said he had his feet wet. Well, I believe him. And it's time to get our feet wet with your wetness. Dr. Kloppenborg, if I may, why did you write this book? What was your motivation, if I may, with simple questions?
Well, the simple point is that I realized that no one had ever used the rich data that we have on associations to help us think about Christ groups. So one of the earlier really game-changing books was by Wayne Meeks in 1983. He mentioned associations, but at that point we knew so little about them that it didn't help very much. And in the time between the mid 80s and now, we know an awful lot more because an awful lot more has been published. And so this was the time to put together what we know about associations and see whether that helps us change the picture that Meeks had painted, or at least nuance and develop the picture that Wayne Meeks had developed in his book, The First Urban Christians.
Did you find that your book actually did make it more nuanced and it's brought more color to the picture?
Yeah, and that's partly because I was able to raise questions that he hadn't raised simply because he didn't have the data. He did talk about rituals like meals and and how groups fit or fail to fit into the city. But since we have so much more data on that now, we can ask the questions again with a lot more nuance and a lot more care and produce some, I think, some more interesting results.
Excellent. Excellent. I'm going to ask a few of my questions. We already have a bunch of super chats, which means the audience is like, yes, I want to have my question answered. So I'll try to bounce back and forth. And I'm always curious about Jews and Gentiles in this era. There's this interesting evolution I see in the New Testament of the movement being purely Jewish, and then Paul with this mission to the Gentiles. And so my question goes like this. I imagine the growth and development of early Christ movement, or the Christ movement, with Paul going to the Gentiles, and that he was specifically targeting synagogues for God-fearers, which would have been Gentiles or God lovers. Were there more places to get Gentiles other than the synagogues? And do we take Acts at its word when it says he kept going to the synagogue every time to try and find them? What have you figured out? Do you have any idea?
Well, let me start with your point about Acts. You're right, that as you read Acts, it appears that Paul has a pattern where he enters a city. He first goes to the synagogue. He has a little bit of success there, but ultimately gets thrown out. And then he goes to non-Jews and gets lots of success there. And then he heads off to the next city. That picture is actually at some variance with Paul's own statements about himself. Paul says that he's an apostle to the Gentiles, and the agreement that he had worked out with the fellows in Jerusalem was that he would go to the Gentiles and they would go to Judeans. And so I think it's increasingly the case that scholars treat Acts narrative as a kind of Luke's own view of how things probably worked. But it's a view that actually doesn't cohere, as I say, with Paul's own view. There's a specific letter where it's really clear that this is not how it worked. And that's the first letter that we've got, the letter to the first letter to the Thessalonians. If you read this carefully, you should notice a couple of things. First off, the addressees are non-Jews. There are no Jews in it at all, because he says of them, everybody has heard how you turned from idols to serve the true and living God. Well, this is not something that you would say about a Jew. It's something that is meaningful only if Paul is talking only to Gentiles. Second, 1 Thessalonians never quotes the Hebrew Bible. And if Paul were speaking only to Gentiles, why would he quote the Hebrew Bible? They don't know it. It's not a source of authority for them. And that's really at variance with the picture that you see in Acts 17, where Acts gives you a narrative of Paul in Thessaloniki, and there he says he first goes to a synagogue, and runs into some trouble there, and then he goes to Gentiles. Well, I think if you have to ask, who do we believe in this point at this point, Paul's own letter to the Thessalonians or Acts? I think you have to believe 1 Thessalonians, and you see Acts as a kind of generalization or idealization, and in fact, something of a distortion of what Paul was actually doing.
Yeah, because
so Peter, I mean, your other.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, please. Yeah, because Peter is supposed. Yeah. You also asked the question: were there other places to go to find Gentiles other than synagogues? Absolutely, practically everywhere. It's a Gentile world in which Jews are a tiny minority. Paul was apparently an artisan. Acts calls him a skenopoios, which gets translated as a tent maker. I think it's more likely that he's an awning maker. A skene is also an awning, the kind of thing that you would put up in front of your house to keep the Mediterranean sun off of it, or in stadiums and so forth. So these skene were used basically as kind of sun shields. And we know that there are groups, artisanal guilds called skenopoioi. So I think it's the likeliest scenario is Paul goes to Thessaloniki. He's an artisan, and anybody entering an ancient city that they knew nothing about previously would have no difficulty in finding people that they were allied with. You know, I use the example of, you know, if you're an American and you drive to a city in the US that you've never been to before, and if you can't find a Starbucks within about 20 minutes, you're not, you know, you don't come from here, right? That is, everybody, I think, in the US has a kind of innate culture, not quite innate, but cultural knowledge of how an American city is laid out and where you're going to find certain things. And so, you know, you head for a mall, or you know, there's other places that you head, and you're going to find a Starbucks pretty quickly. Similarly, in an ancient city, since trades tended to cluster, that is, a street might be called the street of the weavers, or the street of the awning makers, or the street of the leather workers, or something like that. All you need to do is to go into the city and ask someone, where do the awning makers hang out? And they'll say, well, you go down here and here. There you are. So I think the likeliest scenario for Paul connecting with the Thessalonian group is that he's connected with an artisanal group that represents his trade or a related trade. Most of them are going to be Gentiles, and he connects with them pretty quickly when he goes into town. So how do you connect with Gentiles? It's pretty easy. You do it through whatever identity you have, and one of his identities is an artisan. So he uses an artisanal identity to connect.
Well said. This is quite detailed responses. I really appreciate the kind of energy and time you're putting into this kind of response.